Hey folks, and welcome back to my channel. I wanted to tackle a little bit of a tricky topic today. I'm afraid I'm going to get lots of hate just from people reading the title and judging the video by its cover, but nevertheless, I think it's important, and I want to talk about working for free. I feel like I have heard it's been kind of like a hot topic lately. Lots of illustrators talking about how illustrators and creative people should not work for free and how damaging it is when they do. And I'm going to say upfront, I am 100% on board with this. I do not work for free. I never have worked for free, and I strongly recommend against it. It's not a good policy. There are all kinds of reasons that it's not helpful for you strategically in your career, lots of which you can read about online and hear about from other sources. And there are lots of things that you can do besides working for free that will help your career strategically, build out your portfolio, push it in a direction that you want it to go, all of that. Now, that being said, I am a realist, and I know that while I never took on any free or unpaid client work when I was first getting started, back in the beginning, I did agree to some ridiculously low rates that are just, not even that much better than working for free, and was paid a fraction of what I should have been charging. And I also know that it's something we all decry publicly and we all say is bad, and we do all agree it's bad and damaging for the industry and for the illustrators when they work for free. I also know that many illustrators, when they're getting started, they do still agree to work for free, or like I did, they agree to work for very, very low rates and take on that low or no paying work when they're trying to get their foot in the door. So even though this is not ideal, this is not a good situation, I don't endorse it, and I hope we can all be moving towards a future where all illustrators charge fair, livable wages for their work and are paid fair, livable wages for their work. I want to have an honest conversation about two really important things to keep in mind if you do decide to take on work that is not paying that industry standard, that's not paying a livable wage, whether it's free work or work that is significantly reduced. Okay, so first, if you do decide to take on one of these projects, just because you agree to a project that doesn't pay as much as it should, does not mean that you have to agree to all of the client's terms. You should constrain the usage and rights as much as possible. So this is tricky because from what I can tell, folks are most likely to agree to these non-paying or low-paying projects when they're new to illustration and they're not feeling so confident and they're not as familiar with the industry. So they're likely to just accept whatever terms the client dictates, or maybe even leave the issue unaddressed altogether and have those terms just be kind of open-ended. But the problem with this is that you are then getting hit with a double whammy. So the client, number one, is not paying you what you should be paid, whether it's a too low of a wage or no wage at all. And then on top of that, if you don't address the usage terms, or if you just take whatever terms the client dictates to you, you're not getting paid, or you're not getting paid what you should be paid. And then you're also giving away all of these rights for free or for very little. So if you do decide that you can take on, or you want to take on, low or no paying work, you need to limit those rights that the client has as much as possible. So the first thing you need to do to make that happen is to find out how the client wants to use the work, and to really, really limit the work only to that purpose, and make sure they're signing a contract. We'll talk more about this later too. But for example, if the work is going to be used on social media, put together a contract that dictates that that work can only be used on social media for a limited number of posts for a limited period of time, and make sure that the client understands that and signs the contract. Another example, if the work is going to be used by a very small business or a student publication, make sure you stipulate the number of times it can be used, the number of times it can be reproduced. Basically, think of every way possible that you can limit the uses that the client is going to get to just a very, very small, specific area. And that way you're building in some protection for yourself should the client want to increase the rights down the road, or should you find another use for that illustration. All of those other rights should be yours you should keep as many as possible and really clearly stipulating those terms for the client. In the best case scenario, really getting clear and down into the nitty-gritty might even make the client realize what kind of value they are asking for and be more willing to pay you a fair wage. And another example, say this work is going to be used by a really small business on some kind of product packaging. Stipulate where they can sell it. Make sure they can only sell it in a really small local or regional area. Stipulate the number of times they can reproduce that illustration each year. And you could even lay out on top of that in the contract what it would cost if the client wants to increase or needs to increase the usage and the value that they're getting out of that illustration in the future. So, in that small business example, let's say that small business goes from a, sort of garage operation making salsa to suddenly then selling the salsa nationwide at Whole Foods. There should be some kind of a growth plan and an expansion and additional compensation for you if you have taken on the risk of working with a small company and being paid not what you should be paid. Then there's even more reason that if that company does take off, you should be like an investor. You should be somebody who is then getting compensated appropriately for the amount of value that you brought to that business. So the number one thing to remember is just because you are new to the industry and feeling not very confident and agreeing to take on work that is less than you should be paid does not mean that the client should get carte blanche with your work. In fact, it means the exact opposite. If they're not paying you a fair rate, you have even more power, and you should not feel afraid to exercise that control over your work and make sure you're really curtailing the uses and constraining the rights that the client has to that work. Okay, so point number 2, we're constraining the usage and rights, and now we're also going to constrain the process and the project itself. So similarly, if you are in this situation where you've agreed to take on work that is not paying a fair wage, you should not be at the client's mercy with respect to the terms of the project. So and what I mean by terms are the timeline, the number of revisions, basically everything that goes into the process of actually making the work. So if the client is coming to you and they're asking for you to do this work at way below market rate or heaven forbid nothing, you should clearly state the timeline that's going to work for you, that's going to make it easy for you, that's going to allow you to fit it in around your other hopefully paying client work. And limit the number of revisions. That's another really common thing I see, is that people agree to do the work, and because they're not really getting paid for it, or they're not getting paid what they should, they just kind of take whatever terms the client brings, and then the work ends up going from a small not fairly paid project to a huge not fairly paid project, because the client, who doesn't appreciate the value that they're getting out of it, just keeps adding on more and more requests for changes and increases and things that make the project kind of spin out of control. And as a part of this, you could even explicitly state that when you're working on projects that don't compensate you at your usual rate, at a market rate, you need to fit them in around your other work. And the client, maybe you don't actually have other work at that time, but the client doesn't need to know that. You have power here. You are in control. You can make the client understand in a kind way. I'm not saying you should be rude. I think pretty much in every circumstance possible, whenever you can, you should be kind. Especially because there are situations when, at least I have had this happen many times, when I've been asked to do free or low paying work, the person who's asking me is just a middle person. They're not the big boss. They're not the one who is deciding on this ridiculous budget or lack of a budget. So I try to make it a policy to always be as kind as possible. But that doesn't mean that you can't be really clear about what your constraints are and what your limitations are when you do decide to take on these kinds of projects, if you do decide to take on these kinds of projects. So the client who is asking for this work for less than a market rate should understand that they're not going to have the same priority in your to-do list as a client who is paying market rate. Along this same theme, you can also let them know that with projects that don't pay market rate, you have to limit the number of revisions. So let's say maybe Like me, you typically do 2 revisions. Maybe you would say, I'm only going to do 1 revision, or I'm not going to do any revisions. That is all negotiable and up to you. And again, as the person who's being asked to work for little or nothing, you have a lot of power here. So to reiterate, basically be kind and professional, but make this process as easy for yourself as possible. And don't feel like you need to bend over backwards to make the client's terms work, or to do things the way that they say they want them done, just because that's what they mentioned in the beginning. If they're asking you to make the concession on price, then you need to demand that they make some other concessions on the process and the uses that will make it more favorable to you down the road. Okay, and to bring it all together with these 2 points, you want to make the client sign a contract with these terms, a contract that stipulates the uses that they're going to have, the uses that they don't have, and what it would look like if they wanted to increase the uses in the future, and then what the process itself will be like. So how long it's going to take, how many revisions they're going to get, what they're going to get in the end in terms of the final work, the deliverable. So that way, even if you do take on one of these low or no paying jobs, you are constraining it as much as possible and making the client sign a contract to that effect. So there are going to be some situations, don't be surprised if the client asks you to do free or or low paying work, where if you ask them to sign a contract, they're just going to run for the hills, and you are better off without them. That's the worst kind of client. Because they were just not only planning on taking advantage of you in terms of the pricing, they're taking advantage of you in terms of these other things that we talked about, the usage and the process. So really, really hold your ground and hold firm that if you are in the place where you decide you want to take on one of these projects, that you're going to demand that the client sign a contract. Kindly, professionally demand that the client sign a contract that stipulates all of your allowed uses and terms. And I think this can be challenging to do because, again, as we already talked about, much of the time when you're in this situation, you are new in the industry and you're not feeling very confident. And then I think on top of it, this is just my very non-professional psychoanalysis here, but I think on top of that, when you agree to work for free or for much less than you should be paid, that has an impact on how you feel about yourself, and it can make you feel like you're weaker and like you have less power. But remember that you actually should have more power in that situation. If you decide to give up some of the power around pricing, that is your choice. Again, I will say it again here because I said it at the beginning, but I just want to reiterate, I do not recommend working for free. I don't work for free, and I always encourage and hope that artists will demand a fair wage for their work. But if you do decide to make that decision, just remember that you still have power and control in these other areas. You can still demand terms and usage that are favorable to you, and a process that works well and makes the project as easy as possible for you. I feel like it's sad when artists agree to work for free, but it's really tragic when they agree to work for free and they give away all of these other rights and terms to their work. And this has been said by lots of other people. I don't know who said it first, but always do remember that you are the creative person, you're the creative talent here, and despite what it may feel like when you get asked to work for free, they need you more than you need them, and you don't owe them anything. Deciding to take on a low or non-paying job is never ideal, as we have talked about, but if you do make that decision, just remember how much power you really have in the situation, and don't let the client take that away from you. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions or comments on this topic. Leave those in the comments. I do my best to answer those. Sometimes it takes me a few weeks just because I'm working on other stuff, on client projects that are also time specific, so I can't always get to them right away, but I do read every single one. I really appreciate all the comments that you guys leave, and a lot of the questions too make their way into future Q&A videos. So leave all that good stuff in the comments. And many thanks as always to my patrons for supporting this channel and for making it possible for me to create videos for you all week after week. And big thanks as well to Meg for editing this video. Yeah, and thanks of course to all of you guys for watching and subscribing. And yes, I will see you in the next video. Have a great week. Bye.